Hello, we are the band One Direction, and we are going to read Bree Hickey's Assignment 1 about the origin of species by Charles Darwin. Hi, I'm Harry, and I'm going to be reading the summary of the introduction of the origin of species. Darwin begins his introduction explaining how his work is almost complete, but does not want to give the readers much information until then, and how other known scientists have approved of Darwin's research to publish. Darwin goes into detail about how his abstract must necessarily be imperfect. He states this because he wants the readers to trust and believe in his research by not stating his references. He did this to create a fair result. Darwin mentions that naturalist views are those who believe that each species have been descended from other species and that the species have changed among time due to external conditions. He contradicts their beliefs by stating how different species structures have been so specially modified for this to be true. Darwin speaks to the readers about what to expect when reading the abstract of his work: hereditary modification, variability of species, competition to exist among species, and the inheritance. He then mentions how natural selection is inevitably the cause of extinction of the less improved ways of life, and how this will be discussed in Chapter 4 of his work. Darwin concludes his introduction with explaining how he strongly believes that natural selection has most power in nature when it comes to modification. We are skipping Liam because he is a turd. We are going on to Louie. Hi, I'm Louie, and I'm going to read a summary of Chapter 5, Laws of Variation of Origin of Species for Bree. Darwin begins the chapter stating how he remarks his statement in the first chapter that the reproductive system is immensely susceptible to changes in conditions of life. He then goes on to say that he feels environmental factors have very little effect on animals and rather more on plants. Darwin refers back to the first chapter once again to explain how animal strengths and/or parts of modifications are inherited. He uses ostriches as an example to show us how ostriches are such large birds that use their legs much more than their wings, so eventually they just became incapable of flying. Acclimatization of plants, which is the process of them adjusting to new climate or conditions, also impacts natural selection. The law of correlated variations, where one part of an animal or plant corresponds with another, goes along with modifications due to inheritance. Darwin mentions how if a structure in a plant or animal becomes less and less useful and does not benefit the plant or animal whatsoever, natural selection will take place to eventually remove it altogether. He states how him and other authors believe that rudimentary parts are highly variable to be modified and have the tendency to be reversed, which can often be traced back to the trait of the common ancestor. Hi, I'm Zane, and I'm going to be reading The Scientific Progress of Darwin's Variation Theories. Sorry for the shaky camera. Okay. A summary of Darwin's beliefs stated above is how all species and modifications over time, and all species come from pre-existing form, and also how they all share a common ancestor. Darwin knew that variation occurs within species but didn't really understand how. For example, Darwin discusses the ostrich's inability to fly as birds in Chapter 5 of Origin of Species. Using Darwin's laws of variation, he proves how their small wings became less useful due to their large weight and long necks to where eventually they lost their ability to fly. A quote from a source discusses how a large variation in growth is common amongst ostriches. They are generally being farmed extensively, exposing them to various environmental factors that influence growth, but it does not explain the variation seen within flocks due to genetic factors. This shows how genetics plays a large role in variation, which Darwin really never understood. In other words, this answers his question on how variation works. We have merged Darwin's ideas about variation with Gregor Mendel's theories of genetics to form modern synthesis. Modern synthesis is today's theories of evolution, which introduced the idea that evolution changes in alleles with frequencies and populations, which is what greatly affects variation in species. We now understand that hereditary variation is the consequence of many random allelic combinations, and each allele usually has a small phenotypic effect. One of the major conclusions on modern biology is that evolution is gradual, in terms of small genetic changes and recombination, and in terms of ordering of this genetic variation by natural selection. This major conclusion is based off of Darwin's views from Origin of Species, integrated with new research about genetics. Darwin was also unaware about DNA and how important it is for variation. Another source states how genetic variation is the difference in DNA sequences between individuals within a population. This occurs due to genetic recombination, which is the mixing homologous DNA strands. This shuffles the paternal and maternal DNA, creating a combination of variants in the daughter's DNA cells. Overall, Charles Darwin's theory of variation has given us the foundation we need to make further discoveries about variation. Variation is one of the core values of modern biology. Without Darwin's discoveries and studies about variation, we would not have nearly as much knowledge about evolution as we do today. Now, Niall is going to discuss the summary of the last chapter, chapter 14, which is his conclusion on the origin of species. Darwin recapitulates his theory of natural selection and states his concluding remarks about his work. He starts off with explaining how there are many theories that can be used to explain natural processes, but how he believes that there is proof that natural selection is most definitely one of them. Darwin then continues his conclusion with discussing the topic of sterility between hybrids and the first generations and how it sways from whether the more modified organisms are more sterile or not. Geographical distribution and environmental changes often affect the theory of descent with modification in a negative way. He also believes that there are more errors in the geological record than we assume. Variation is governed by different variables, correlation of growth, and physical conditions of life that keep variation on track, and if the variables remain the same, variation will continue until the end of time. Darwin discredits other natural theories about how some species are not real in each genus and that other species have been individually created by asking multiple questions on how this could be true. Analogy shows how all organic beings have descended from a primordial form. He says how classification of species will make much more sense as time passes for us to study their characteristics. We're One Direction, and thank you for listening to Bree's paper.